Here back in November to give the talk to a general audience, but tried to get it advertised, but especially for the Faith Formation family. But I just wanted to send the families off with a deeper understanding of the Shroud for our last session here, because it sure is a very interesting topic, and it helped me increase my faith, and I sure hope it increases yours. So without further ado, I present to you Lynn Bardsley.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So this presentation on the Shroud of Turin is a demonstration of how science can help to advance our faith by helping to discover the truth. This Shroud of Turin is currently in Turin, Italy, and it's known by many to be the linen cloth that wrapped Christ's body when he was taken from the cross following his crucifixion. I'm going to reference the Shroud going forward as Jesus' burial cloth, but obviously you can believe what you want. This cloth that Jesus left for us, as you can see here, follow the red dot, is a document that tells a story. Not only did Jesus leave his blood on the cloth, which depicts every detail of the enormous pain and agony he suffered during his passion and crucifixion, but he also left a high-resolution, three-dimensional image of his body on the cloth. As you can see down here, this isn't exactly it. This is a rendition of it. Through science and technology, we're now able to accurately display the body of Christ from the data encapsulated on the linen cloth. In addition, there's physical evidence found on the cloth that depicts an incredible 2,000-year journey from Jerusalem to Turin, Italy, kept safe during those years by those who understood its supernatural value. So, as we know in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus was crucified and died. You can see in this picture here. Following his death, he would have had a cloth placed over his face, just as we do now with a deceased body. And when his body was taken down from the cross, it was wrapped in a linen shroud, as you can see here, and carried into the tomb. And you can see in these famous paintings. After 3 days, two of his disciples, Peter and John, entered the tomb and found that Jesus was gone. They also found Jesus' face cloth that had covered his face was neatly folded on the rock slab where he'd lain, and the linen shroud he was wrapped in was in a pile on the floor of the tomb. The bloodstained face cloth is now known as the Sudarium of Oviedo, and ended up in Cathedral in Oviedo, Spain. It's unsure exactly what happened to the linen shroud at this point, but my guess is that the disciples may have brought the cloth to Jesus' mother Mary for safekeeping until her passing. For the past 2,000 years since the shroud was first found, this is all people saw, a faded image of a man on the cloth. Here's the front, and here's the back image. Tens of thousands of Christians have venerated this relic, and through their faith, they believed it to be Jesus' true burial cloth. However, with the rapidly evolving advanced technologies, research is now able to show that this is the burial cloth of Christ. Like I said, this cloth is all they saw for 2,000 years, until about 125 years ago, the first photograph of the shroud was taken by an Italian named Secondo Pia. And what happened was he took the picture and with his old box camera, and he went to his darkroom to develop it. And when he looked down into his developing pan at the negative image, he saw the face of Christ looking up at him. This is the most amazing discovery, started the world talking. And what had happened was that Secondo Pia saw the face of Christ in his pan, and that should have been the negative image, as if you've ever developed film, it should have been the negative image of whatever he'd taken a picture of. But instead, it turns out that this is the positive image. The whole face and both sides of his body have been taken. That's the positive image, and what's on the actual shroud is a negative image. How amazing is it that Jesus left his negative image on the shroud, as shown here on the right, that could be turned into the detailed high-resolution 3D image shown on the left. How do we know that this actual image on the shroud is a negative image? We can tell that from the sword wound. Remember, Christ was pierced on his right side after his death while he was on the cross. And here on the shroud, you see the blood mark, but this is on his left side. And that's what happens with negative images. You see the mirror image of reality. But in what they think is the negative image, but is actually the positive image, you see the blood mark right here on his right side where it should be. So here we see the high-resolution grayscale images showing the front and the back of Jesus with 3D properties encoded in the grayscale so that parts of the body pop out and appear to be three-dimensional. There's the creases here on his face, going across the face, are actually from being displayed in a frame. The shroud was displayed in a frame for many years to display to the public, and only the face was shown so that people could see the face of Christ, which you actually see here in front of me. This is the face of Christ from the shroud. There's scorch marks you can see going up and down here on the body. That was from a fire that nearly destroyed it back in the 1500s. And there's patches, these patches in black and gray were patches sewn over the shroud to keep it together after the fire. And also notice these white marks all over the body are actually blood marks that show up under ultraviolet light. Notice over here, the blood dripping from the crown of thorns. And you can also see from the back image here, see the length of his hair. It goes down to about his shoulder blades. And also notice, because we're going to talk about it later, there's some different blood patterns on his two arms. And we'll talk about that, why, later. The blood spear here, which we saw before. And also notice on his back side, there's something appearing to be hanging down from his waist, down his back. And that's something we'll discover later. So there's 3 elements on the shroud. And this is a picture of the shroud, actual picture of it. The linen fibers are herringbone tweed, and it's a very, very fine, exquisite piece of cloth. There's the 3 elements they see on it are the blood stains, fibers with image on top of it, and also they find physical properties of where the cloth has been during its history. So first, the blood on the shroud. This blood on the shroud tells us the story of Jesus' passion and death. The blood is a rare AB type positive blood. It's the same type found on the Sudarium of Oviedo. Remember the cloth that had been put over his head when he came down from the cross. It matches almost perfectly with the blood stains on the shroud. The blood contains male DNA, but they can't get any other information from the DNA because it's just so old. The blood plasma around the blood stains can be revealed under ultraviolet light, and that's why you see the white marks on the shroud where the blood stains are. These stains match the description of the torture of Jesus in the Gospels, and these stains were there before the image was formed on the cloth. The second element is the image on the shroud. This tells us the story of Christ's resurrection. This is a really high-resolution negative image, like we said, of a 5'9", 175-pound man burned under the top 1% of the linen fibers with 3-dimensional properties. Physicists propose that this image was produced by something called directional vacuum ultraviolet radiation coming from within the body at the moment of resurrection. Now, if you look at these pictures here of Christ on the shroud, or images, you can actually see sort of the bones in his hands, and you can see his teeth in this picture. And that's not actually his beard, those are his top teeth. And this is similar to what you'd see on an X-ray, but if you think about the energy coming from inside the body out, it would go through his bones and teeth, and it would be displayed onto the cloth outside his body. Now, this is about the amount of energy to create this image would be about several billion watts of light released for about 1/40 billionth of a second. That's what it would take, and we don't have enough energy in the world to create that here on Earth. It's similar to 600,000 times brighter than this football field, or 6 times more energy than Hiroshima. So imagine that blast happening in that tomb. Would have been so fast, no one probably would have even seen it. We'll find out a bit later that it might not have been just one flash. So here we see actual picture of the shroud with some burned radiation burn on the top fibers. And when you zoom in, you can see it's just on the very top fibers of the shroud. So think about Hiroshima bomb without the heat, but just the light. All right. And of course, we can't reproduce this today. So the third element on the shroud are physical things, such as they found pollen from Jerusalem on the head part of the cloth, probably from his crown of thorns. They found soil from Jerusalem on the nose area of the cloth. And we know when Christ carried the cross, he fell 3 times and possibly fell on his face. We also see limestone on his knees and his feet from falling with the cross on his back onto the ground. You can see the sewn patches I talked about before and the water stains. There's also pollen from Turkey and Western Europe seen all over the cloth. So it's made its rounds from Jerusalem to Europe. Now, this shroud followed an incredible 2,000-year path through history that can only be explained by the providence of God. It started out by this map. You can see, here's Italy to get some reference here. It started out in Jerusalem, and then about 17 years after his death, it was carried to Edessa, Turkey, was there for almost 900 years, hidden away in a wall for a good part of that time, and then was taken to Constantinople because Edessa was being invaded, and was there about 250 years and owned by the Byzantine kings there. And then as they were being invaded, the Knights Templar, it's thought that the Knights Templar got the shroud and carried it to Athens, Greece, where it kind of disappeared for about 150 years and then ended up in France, in Léry, France, and its first owner was someone from Léry, France, and then brought to Chambéry and finally to Turin, Italy, where it's been there for hundreds of years, safe in the cathedral there. Here's a picture of Edessa when it was first carried there by one of Jesus' apostles. His name is St. Jude Thaddeus, and he's known to carry this shroud to King Abgar to heal him, and it's believed he had leprosy, and once he was healed, he turned his whole area into Christianity. But unfortunately, after his death, his children didn't have the same beliefs, so they had to hide the shroud. They hid it in a stone wall for about 500 years, and it wasn't found. Here's a picture of the stone walls there in Edessa. It wasn't found until there was a flood, and they were redoing the town, and there's this shroud in the wall. When they brought it out, people started to display the face of Christ, like I said, in a frame, and people started painting the face. And as you can see here, the remarkable resemblance of the artist's face with the actual shroud overlaid in that picture and also in this picture. The other pictures that were painted over the years show some of the blood marks from the crown of thorns, and also this middle picture is determined to be one of the most scientifically exact pictures. It was painted by an Armenian artist in 1935. So once it left Edessa, because Edessa fell, it arrived in Constantinople, and they proudly displayed it in front of their church for people to see. And immediately a coin was minted with Jesus' face on it. And on the back of the coin it says, Jesus Christ, King of Kings. Then when Constantinople was being invaded, it's believed the Knights Templar, which is a Christian military order that were there to protect Christians and other artifacts. It's believed that they got the shroud and other artifacts and moved it away from the enemies. And some believe it went to Athens, Greece, but it really did. The history books have many different theories, and for the next 150 years, nobody really knows where it was. But it did end up in France, and Geoffrey de Charnay was a fourth-generation Knights Templar. So over time, the Knights kept track of this, I think, and he actually got this in a wedding present as a wedding dowry from his wife's family. So it was his wife's family who had access to the shroud and gifted it to him. And after he died, his granddaughter, Margaret, inherited the shroud, and she displayed it all on the palace walls for her guests to see. And she used to sew velvet ruffles around it to make it look pretty. And she exhibited it in many countries around Europe. And finally, she traded the shroud to Duke Louis of Savoy for 2 castles. And as a result of this, she was excommunicated from the church. So this Duke of Savoy was the next owner for 500 years. And they were really, it was kind of like a country in Europe, between Italy and France for many years, like in the Alps area. And during that time, it was taken around and showed all over Europe. And in 1532, a fire broke out where the shroud was being held. It was in a silver box, and as the box burned, drips of silver came down, and you can see how it was folded. And when it was unfolded, you see the marks of the fire. So unfortunately, it hid the shoulders and upper arms, but the rest of it remained to be seen. And as a result of this, it was moved to Turin, Italy, for safekeeping. And although the Savoy family retained ownership until 1983, on his deathbed, the last king of Italy bequeathed it to Pope John Paul II, who appointed the Archbishop of Turin as its custodian. And here's where it lies now, in Turin, Italy, in St. John the Baptist Cathedral. You can see the inside. Here it is on the front near the altar. And it was there for almost 450 years, except for 2 short times when it was moved for the protection during the World Wars. And it was moved to this abbey in southern Italy under the altar for 7 years because Hitler wanted to get his hands on it. And it was known, so it was secreted away and hidden here for 7 years. And then after 1,000 years following Christ's death, the first public exposition of the shroud was in Turin. So people could take pictures of it and see what it looked like. And then in '69, the first color photo was taken, and the color kind of brought out some features, sort of some 3-dimensional things that they hadn't seen before in the black and white. And it was really the precursor to discovering that there was 3-dimensional information in this. So in '75, there was a scientist, Peter Schumacher. He worked for NASA, and he invented this VPA image analyzer, which is a computer application with some hardware, and it was developed to see which stars are closer than the others out in the universe. So it showed a 3-dimensional property of things. Well, they had the idea of putting the face, the image of the shroud, under that analyzer, and what they saw was that it indeed had 3-dimensional information encoded in the grayscale image. And if you put a photograph of your grandchild, you would not see that 3-dimensional information. So then research really started to take off after this. In 78, the Shroud underwent a huge research project called STIRP. And there were scientists brought from all over the world in all these different areas of expertise. And they studied that shroud for 5 days and 5 nights. And they came to the determination at the end of that whatever left this imprint on the shroud is something like radiation or extreme light energy. And that the shroud image is that of a real human being that was scourged and crucified, not the product of an artist. And that the blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and give a positive test for serum albumin, which means that this is something the blood produces under severe stress, as Christ would have been during his passion and crucifixion. And then in 88, some skeptics decided to do a carbon dating. And they took a piece of the cloth from the one lower corner here, and it showed that they sent it out to 3 separate labs, and it showed that the shroud was dated in the medieval ages. And so for many years after that, people still believe that to this day, some of them, that it's just a fake. But what happened was that this piece of cloth was actually a piece that had been sewn on in the Middle Ages, probably because it was so used and torn and frayed. And they recently have dated the shroud to be 50 years plus and minus 150 years, or 50 AD plus and minus 150 years, which is at the time of Christ. And so as a result of the 3-dimensional information they're starting to find, this Dr. Petrus Soons decided to take the image of the shroud and create a hologram image, which is 3-dimensional. And it's sort of hard to understand what they are, but it's actually shining light rays in through the image, so that the front and the rear of the shroud can now be seen as a hologram. And as a result of that, they found many things that were hidden that they couldn't see before. For example, they found that there were flower pollen spores around his head, placed around his head like a wreath of flowers, and also at his hands, probably a bouquet of flowers. And these flowers are these identical ones, the rock rose and chrysanthemum, that are grown in Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion. So they found the spores of these on those areas of the shroud. They also discovered there was a solid oval object under his beard, and you can sort of see it here in this image of the shroud. And it was actually like a necklace they used to wear at that day, an oval object, and on the oval object they determined the 3 Hebrew letters actually mean small cattle, sheep, or goats. And as we know, Jesus is called the Lamb of God. So he was buried with that, or not buried, but entombed with that. They also found 2 coins, one on each eye, and they went back to the time of Pontius Pilate, 29 AD in Judea. This was common, too, to keep the eyes closed of a dead person. And then more recently, some scientists were trying to duplicate the image on the shroud, and they actually used a laser that you'd see in the dentist's office, which was not very strong, but they were able to get some coloration on the shroud, but they certainly didn't achieve what we see on the shroud. But what it did was they were able to determine how much energy it would have taken, as we said before, several billion watts of light. And so that's how we get to that information. Now, in 2009, their first 3-dimensional statue of Christ was created, and they said this is a 3D carbon copy of Jesus using the Shroud of Turin. You notice how the rigor mortis in the body is still, it can be displayed on the shroud as with the rigor mortis in it, because he was on the cross more than 3 hours. So rigor mortis would have set in, and that's how he was taken into the tomb. The only changes, of course, would be that his hands were taken down from being like this and crossed over. Then we get some more imagery. There's a famous digital artist who took the image from the shroud, and the computer created a face. And here's the face with skin and hair. The picture you see on the right is actually a famous poster that I've seen hanging at Spa Catholic when I was there. It shows the modern-day looking face of Christ. And here's an AI recreation of the likeness of Christ's face on the Shroud of Turin, starting with the shroud and the positive image or negative image, and that this is what the AI generated. And finally, the most recent magical replication of Christ would be this mystery man, where a Spanish scientist studied for many years the shroud and created this life-size model in latex and silicone. And it's perfect down to the skin, the pores in the skin and the hair. This is supposed to be on tour around the globe in the next 20 years. And it has all the scourge marks that can be seen on the shroud. Now, in the last 6 years, the shroud has undergone a lot of scientific analysis, and they got together a lot of doctors and physicists and chemists and artists, and they were able to come up with a bunch of images of what Christ's body would look like based on the information on the shroud. These images can be disturbing, but they should be disturbing because they show us the reality of the passion and crucifixion. And by the way, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ movie was based on this forensic evidence that we see here. If anyone has ever seen it, it's pretty bloody. So Christ, we know, was beaten initially. Here's the face on the shroud, and here's the rendition by the forensic scientists. There were puncture wounds on his head from the placement of crowns. He's got a swollen right eye and cheekbone from blows to his face with a stick-like object. He has a crushed nose, but not broken, from either beating and or from falling on his face when he was walking with the cross. And sections of his beard were pulled out. And all of this is talked about in the Gospels. Then there was the scourging. There were about 120 lashes. You can see on the actual shroud, you can see where some of these were placed. I believe this is his chest. Here are two of the whips that were used. They believe there were two scourgers, a right-handed and a left-handed one, and the wounds on his body match the tips of the scourge of the whips. And over here you see the computer-generated models of where exactly on the front and back the scourge marks were located. And you can see it's located along his buttocks, which were probably not covered. So what happened here was that Jesus really wasn't, Pontius Pilate hadn't really planned for Jesus to die, so he ordered him to be severely scourged and released. And if he'd planned for Jesus to die, he would have ordered a milder scourging, if there's such a thing, and then he would have been crucified so that he wouldn't die on the way to crucifixion. But however, Jesus had the severe scourging, and then the public called for him to be crucified, and Pilate allowed it to happen. So as a result, he was scourged nearly to death and then crucified on the cross. Pilate was surprised to hear that Christ had died in only 3 hours on the cross, but this is because his body was suffering from shock, both the loss of blood and from upper body trauma as a result of the scourging. And experts now believe, they used to believe that he died from asphyxiation, from not being able to get a breath, but experts now believe that he died from this double shock to his body that ultimately killed him earlier than expected. Then the crown of thorns was put on his head, and we see it wasn't really a crown, it was more like a cap of thorns. And here a picture of the thorns. They're 2-inch thorns from a tree. And these wounds would have been most severe on his head as he was being nailed to the cross. He would have been laid down on the ground, and the thorns would have pushed into the back of his head, which you can see here. In the back image, there's a lot of blood on the back of his head. And the infamous, they call it a 3. They believe it's a reversible 3 on his forehead from blood. And then there were the spikes. There was one in each wrist, not in the hand, but in the wrist. And as a result of being in the wrist, the ulnar nerve would have been pierced, causing his thumbs to be retracted. Notice on the shroud picture here, you don't see his thumbs. And also there was one spike, not two, put in his feet. His left foot was crossed over his right, and the spike went in the top of the left and out the heel of the right. And if you look at the shroud here, you can see here's the back of his body, and here's the right heel right here, where the nail came out and went into the cross. And the renditions of the forensic images here on the right. One thing to notice here is that the different blood flow on the forearms, you notice this is kind of swirly and this is kind of haphazard. And also notice that there's some kind of a point coming out of this wound on his left arm. We'll find out what that is later. So then there was the spear. We know after Christ died, the soldiers wanted to ensure that he was dead, so they speared him in his right side, and they were going for his heart chamber. And what came out of his heart chamber was blood and water. The clear fluid would have been there from the severe trauma of the scourging. And that's what we see in this beautiful Apostle of the Divine Mercy picture. And for those of you who don't know, this came from St. Faustina in 1933 when she was shown a vision by Jesus, and she was told to paint the image or have the image painted of what she saw, and this is the famous image. And if that's not enough, there were more wounds, about 600 wounds on his body totally. Notice here he is carrying a cross, which isn't quite correct because it's believed that he only carried the crossbar on the top, but that he did fall with this, and he probably incurred a dislocated shoulder at this point. They know that it was dislocated from images on the shroud. Later on you'll see. There were abrasions on his back from carrying the cross, and several blows to his neck and shoulders that resulted in partial paralysis on his right side, which you kind of see in the image. His whole right side of his face is kind of drooped. And also notice here the blood from the sword wound actually is running across his back, and you would think it would be running down his legs after he was the sword went through. The blood should have gone down his legs, but it went along the back of his back, and we'll see why that is in a minute. So now the last slides are actually about the most recent scientific analysis and research that's been done by a group of scientists in Italy called the International Institute for Advanced Studies of Space Representation Sciences. And what this means is that they study small pictures, small pieces of the shroud, and analyze it. That's what all those words mean. So they also have an image formation hypothesis that's the latest and greatest and seems to make sense to the physicists in the world. And they've detected movement in the image, which is the most unbelievable thing that one can imagine. And they see nails in the hands and feet on the shroud that were not removed when he was taken down from the cross. And they see other objects in the image. So let's see what we're finding out here. This is they believe the latest image or evidence shows the positioning of the shroud when the image was formed. Now, if Christ's body was wrapped in this shroud, for one thing, there aren't any side images on the Shroud of Turin. So there's only this top and bottom image of the man. So there's no side image. So they believe that the shroud had to have been stretched. He would have been levitated, and the shroud would have been stretched around him, not touching his body, in order to get the image on the shroud. And another reason they believe that is there's no wrinkles in the image. It's perfectly resolute. And look at the image, the wrinkles you would have had if the shroud was still wrapped in the body. And also, because there were no flattening of his bottom from the rock slab, that his bottom was totally like he was just floating in air. It wasn't flattened. So the latest image formation hypothesis shows how the shroud contains three-dimensional information. And so if you imagine, here's the body in its post-mortem state. And if you imagine there's a plane that runs through the center of gravity of his body, this plane, it's not real, but if you consider radiation coming out of his body, perfectly parallel radiation rays coming out of his body, both on the top to image the top of the cloth and out the bottom to image the bottom of the cloth, and that the distance between the body and the cloth is where we get the different colors of gray. So the further the distance, for example, well, take the knees on the top of the body. The knees are closest to the shroud here, and if you look at the front image over here and look at his knees, they're the lightest color. If you look at the back of the shroud, his knees would be the furthest away from this piece of the shroud. And so when you look at depending on where the body, how close it was to the shroud, you get different shades of gray, which is what we're able to get the three dimensions from. This shroud so they say it was imaged by something called parallel projection. And this has never been seen in nature. The only thing we know now in physics and in nature is a laser light projection model down here where you've got one point of light going through an object and making one point on the projection screen in the back. Or, of course, the perspective light model, which we all know, where there's one point of light and shining through an object, we'll get a perspective view of it. But what we're seeing on the shroud is parallel light projection. So there's tons and tons of parallel light rays coming from an unknown source, going through the body and projecting itself exactly as it is on the shroud. And where did this source of light energy come from? Well, if the source of energy came from inside the body, it said that it might be too close to the cloth to create the images we see on the shroud with no distortion. However, if the source of energy came from outside the body and far away, physicists theorized that it had to be like this, generated in a circular fashion in order to produce the image on the shroud. And where did this source of energy come from? I know. Now, this is the most amazing thing. I get goosebumps when I talk about it. So there's 4D imagery on the shroud, and the fourth dimension is time, which means that as Christ was being resurrected, he was moving, and that's been captured on the shroud image. Similar to what we see here, where we do all the time in photography to enhance something, where they take several flashes of light on the same background to get different perspectives of the position of what we want to see. We call this a double or triple exposure. Well, so there's motion shown in the image, and if you start with this 2020 research that I told you about, actually goes in and takes a tiny little piece of the shroud image and analyzes it with the computer, and they look for lines in the software, or in the image. They look for lines, and these lines are actually the edge of something. So if you can see over here, they've colored the lines here in yellow, but these lines are the edge of the same object, only the object has moved. You can just barely make out the lines in the actual shroud image, but they are there. The computer can find them and can display where they are. So that's how they look. Now, what they did was, for example, they looked at the hand here. His left hand has the wound from the nail up here. And so here's the shroud image, and there's the wound, and there's the wound, and then there's the wound. It's moved. It's in 3 places. You can sort of see that in the actual image here without the coloration. You see three sides of the wound. And you also see the hands, the fingers should be outstretched like you see in the rendition up here. But instead, you see bent fingers. They're bent. They're moving. You see them like this, you see them like this. And what's happened is the left hand over the right, the left hand is moving slightly and grasping at something. And on the other hand, now we look at the right hand. And remember I said that they believe his shoulder was dislocated, his right shoulder. See how his right hand is longer than his left hand. That's one reason they believe that. So what they're looking at here on the shroud is they see what looks like in this reproduction here of a hand. They're seeing the 2 index fingers, and then they're seeing the thumb, which was bent under because of the ulnar nerve. And then they're seeing these 2 fingers kind of bent. See that in this picture? You see the 2 fingers, you see the thumb here, and those fingers are bent. Now, you got the same image here, only they're looking at a bigger piece of the hand now, of the image, and you see the same hand here, down here, but you also see another hand up here, where there's a thumb, and there's something, the fingers are bent around something. So here's the thumb, and there's the fingers curled around something. Now, it looks like here, like the right hand is twisting and moving into a grasping position. And what you can see here is the animation of the right hand. So they get it in these different, they captured this image and the last image on the shroud. And what would have happened was that it was like this, and then it did this, and it was twisting and grasping at a strap. Now, what is this strap it's grasping at? We'll find out in a minute. Motion was detected in the hands, like I said. It also appears to be detected in the feet and the chest, which I'm not going to show. But this discovery of multiple locations of the same object shown on the shroud leads us to wonder whether this is actually a partial video of the resurrection of Christ. They also see nails now. They can see nails in the hands. So here's where they looked in this tiny little box here. They took that portion of the shroud and analyzed it, and they can see there's the nail, and you can see that it was in several different places. There's the base of the nail, and it's twisted and moved slightly. And you can also see that the nail, remember I said, look at that point sticking out of the wound? Well, that point is actually the nail sticking out of his wound. His hand would have been nailed to the cross. The back of the nail would go into the cross, and when they pulled it out, the nail's still sticking out of his wound, and he was entombed that way. Because in those days they weren't supposed to touch anything that had blood of a dead person on it. I don't know if that's why they left the nails in there, but they did. So there's the nail sticking out of the wound. And in the feet, it's hard to see that. but down here you can see here's his right foot. Remember I said it went out the right heel into the cross, and when they pulled it out, it was still sticking out of his right heel, which would be here. And it said that his feet were like this as he was crucified and buried, but when he was being resurrected, his feet went to a 90-degree angle, and the nail actually went from outside the foot inside the foot and moved around a bit. So there's proof there that things are moving, and his feet are moving and his hands are moving, as well as the nails. Now remember I said, let's wonder what he's grasping at when his hands are moving. Well, he was wearing a tefillin, which is something that Jews used to wear back for many, many years. And it's actually leather straps, and it holds a box near his heart, here on his forearm, containing verses from the Torah. And there's also one they wear on their head that has a box near his brain. So they want to keep the words of the Torah close to their mind and their heart. So he was wearing this, and we know that because we can see in the shroud, for example, here is the box near his head. You can see the box here and here and here, and it finally, along with a strap, settled here with the final picture on the image on the shroud. And you can also see on the hand the straps. They can see the straps were kind of unraveling down his hand. You can also see the box, not in this picture, but I've seen it, where the box on his arm actually falls down his arm all the way to here. So he's pulling at these Teflon straps. And the unusual blood pattern on his forearms, now we know why, because as he's being crucified, the wounds from the nail would have run down his forearm, and on his left arm was the tefillin. And notice that the wounds are the blood marks kind of go horizontally, sort of between the leather straps. But on the other arm, it's completely different. And they've determined that there's actually a chain hanging down, and the blood went down the chain on this arm and went in between, around the chain links, and caused that pattern. And they actually do see the chain. So the chain was probably fastened to his wrist, and he was probably, because he was a prisoner, he had that chain on probably when he was carrying the cross. And don't know why it was left on, but it probably had blood on it. And that was something that he was entombed with. It was part of his body that was entombed with the tefillin and with this chain. They also found a bracelet in motion on his face. So there was a bracelet that was attached to his head, and you can see it was sort of an amulet. They say it was semi-precious of sort, and it was moving. It was here, and it can be seen in these other locations as well. Sort of like there's oscillating energy coming from wherever it's coming from, causing this to move, to oscillate. And that's a beautiful touch that someone put this beautiful bracelet on his head. And also they found this sudarium. They used it as the face cloth. They actually used it as a pillow underneath Christ's head when they laid him on the tomb. And they folded this about into 80 layers, and it was blood stained. And you can see it got imaged on the shroud. See the image of it right here underneath his head, which is amazing. And that's why they found a cloth neatly folded on the rock slab, but then another one dropped in the middle of the tomb. So what happened was someone had attached the beautiful pendant to this cloth in order for it to be to remain on his head. And they actually found this. It's kind of like a safety pin. You see it down here? It's part of the shroud image, and it's right up here on his head. And that was used to attach the necklace to, or the bracelet to. And now we know that we know now that Christ was wearing a calasan when he was crucified and entombed. And a calasan is something worn back to the Egyptian days, and it would be usually have a belt to hold it up. And we can actually see now, I can't see it, but the computer analysis can, that there's a calasan, and I can actually see the belt. If you look at the naked shroud image over here, you can see there's a belt here. And remember I said how that when he was pierced in the side, and the blood, instead of going down his leg, went across his back, because when it got to the belt, it was suctioned across the back of the belt. I was just reading a book today that claimed that Christ was obviously naked when he was crucified, but this isn't the case. Here's the snakeskin belt. Now you can see it easily in the image along with the belt buckle. And it was probably a python skin, which is shown here as in a python belt. And you sort of see that pattern on the shroud image. So the last thing they found was that when Christ was taken down from the cross, that a strip of the linen cloth was taken off the side. This whole strip was taken off and was tied around Christ's waist like this to take him down without hurting him, without messing with him, take him down easily. And so this was a belt, and it was left on his body when he was entombed, because it was actually imaged when Christ was being resurrected. Along with the shroud image, this image was also on this piece of cloth. And what they did was they found that separate piece of cloth that had been tied around his waist, and they sewed it back onto the side at some point in time. It was sewn back on. And what you can see is this piece on the side now matches exactly where it was on the shroud when the imagery happened. And it shows the same thing on both. It shows the belt buckle moving down his body as the resurrection is happening. So it's just interesting to note that that this was actually done to help him down from the cross. So to end this, I want to say that there's a reason I believe that the shroud is now able to be analyzed in such a fashion with science that we can determine exactly what happened during his passion, death, and resurrection. It was left in the tomb for Jesus' disciples to find for a reason, and it was kept safe for 2,000 years by those who understood its value, until now when science and technology can begin to uncover the mysteries. You've just seen how faith and science can work well together to discover the truth of the shroud. And if anyone's interested, the shroud's on display all over the world. Not the shroud itself, replicas of the shroud, but they look so real. And they were supposed to have a show this year in Turin, which they do every 5 years, but they called it off the last minute, probably due to security reasons. But you can also see there's a beautiful museum in Turin. I believe Anthony's been there. And there's a funeral history in Houston that has a replica of the shroud. And there's some all over the world. I was able to see one down in Huntsville, Alabama, at Mother Angelica's shrine. And it's full life, front and back. And you can go up and touch the scourge marks and see the length of his hair. And it's just amazing what God has done for us. And this is the face from the image on the shroud. And there's references, if anyone's interested, I can hand out. They show, there's some videos of some of the latest discoveries, the motion and all that stuff. It's very interesting, and anyway, thank you for all listening. Yes, please.
How tall was Christ?
Well, it's been said between 5'9" and 6 foot, which is very tall for someone of that, from that.
What's the Arabian
Right. Yes, and he was just, I don't know, he was just a different size. Maybe because God's so tall. Any questions? Yeah. Ah, yeah, yeah. And who would have thought that he has all of this leather strap on his left arm and hand, and he was crucified with that. He was scourged with that on. Just, it's not what you picture when you look at that, right? Just, what was that, Steve? The callus on? Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, Moses wore callus on, just like that. Ah, messianic symbol. Yeah. 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 So, pass on the word. You can do your own research. This Shroud video, it's if you Google it, it's something like astonishing findings from the Shroud. The word astonishing is in there because that's where now they're showing that things are moving. Things are moving right on the Shroud that Jesus left for us to discover. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Thank you.